Why do some Pokemon cards become impossible to forget, while other cards that are rarer, more expensive, and harder to pull eventually fade away? Because the cards we remember years later usually have something that can't be measured, and it's not just rarity or value, it's the story, memory, or feeling attached to that card. And today we're going to look at what separates a normal Pokemon card from one that becomes a true collector favorite. Have you ever looked at a Pokemon card and felt you were only seeing one moment from a much bigger story, like something happened before the artwork began, or something is about to happen after it ends? That feeling is one of the biggest reasons certain cards become unforgettable. Because great artwork doesn't just show you a Pokemon, it gives your imagination somewhere to go. And one of the best examples of this is this Drowsy illustration rare. Because at first glance, nothing incredible is happening. Drowsy is just sitting there. There's no huge battle, no legendary Pokemon, nothing dramatic happening in the scene. But the longer you look, the more questions appear. Why do the people around Drowsy seem so disconnected? What exactly is happening in this scene? Is Drowsy causing this? Or are we seeing something completely different? And that's what makes this artwork so interesting. The card never gives you the full answer. It leaves you room for you to kind of create that story for yourself, and that's something the best Pokemon artwork does. It doesn't just show you a Pokemon, it creates a moment you want to understand. But storytelling doesn't always come from mystery. Sometimes it comes from a perspective. And this Lugia V from Silver Tempest is a perfect example. Because most Lugia cards want you to focus on Lugia, the legendary Pokemon, the power, and the design. But this card does something different. It changes the way you see the entire scene, because hidden underneath Lugia is one small detail. That tiny boat. And suddenly everything changes. Because without that boat, Lugia is just a powerful Pokemon floating across the ocean. But with it, you understand the scale of the moment, the waves, the distance, the tiny person below. Lugia doesn't just feel powerful anymore, it feels enormous. It feels like you're looking at one small moment from a much larger world. And that is what separates memorable artwork from artwork that is simply beautiful. Beautiful artwork makes you admire it, great artwork makes you wonder about it. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons certain Pokemon cards stay with collectors for years. They don't give us every answer, they make us ask more questions. But imagination is only one way a card can become unforgettable. Because sometimes a card doesn't become special because of what we see, it becomes special because of what we remember. The cards we remember most usually aren't the cards we expected to remember. They aren't always the rarest we own, they sometimes aren't even the most expensive. Sometimes they are simply the cards attached to a moment. So think about the Pokemon cards you still remember from when you were younger. Not necessarily the card with the highest value, and not necessarily the hardest card to find, but the card you remember pulling from a pack. The card you traded for, the card you couldn't wait to show someone. Those moments are something a price chart can never measure, because sometimes a Pokemon card stops being a collectible, it becomes a reminder of who we were when we found it, and a perfect example of this is the Birthday Pikachu card. Because if you only looked at the card itself, you might not immediately understand why it was such an important card for collectors. The artwork, it's simple. There's no battle scene again, right? There's not some huge detailed background. By modern standards, it's a very simple idea, but why does it mean so much? Because the most important part of this Birthday Pikachu isn't the artwork, it's that blank space, the small area where you could write your name. And that one detail completely changed the relationship between the collector and the card. Because modern collecting is often about preservation, right? Sleeves, top loaders, grading. Keeping cards as close to as perfect as possible, but this Birthday Pikachu represented something different. You had ownership. As kids, writing your name on a card, it didn't feel like damaging it. It felt like making it yours. That small detail transformed the card from something you owned into something that belonged to you. And I think that is why collectors still connect with this card today. The memory isn't, I own the card, it is, this card was part of my childhood. And that is something Rarity can never recreate. Because you can buy a rare card, you can buy an expensive card, but you can't buy the exact moment when you first discovered one. And sometimes that moment is what makes a card truly special. But personal memories are only one type of connection, because sometimes a card doesn't represent one person's story, sometimes it represents an entire generation of collectors. And that is why a card like the base set Pikachu remains so memorable. Because if you look at it today, it's actually really simple. No crazy artwork, no rarity to it, right? Nothing special about it. Just Pikachu standing in the grass. But for many collectors, this wasn't just a Pikachu card. It was their Pikachu card. It was in binders, it was traded with friends. It was part of the first collections many people, they ever built. And that is when a card becomes something bigger than itself. It becomes a shortcut to a specific moment in time. A reminder of what collecting Pokemon felt like before everything came to be about condition, rarity, and value. So the cards we remember most aren't just the cards we owned. They're the cards that remind us who we were when we collected them. Sometimes a card doesn't just remind us of our own story. Sometimes it becomes a symbol of Pokemon's history itself. Some cards become unforgettable because of the artwork, some become unforgettable because of the memories attached to them, but sometimes a card becomes important because of the moment surrounding it, because a collectible is not created in isolation. Every card exists during a specific time, a specific generation, a specific version of the hobby, and sometimes one card becomes a symbol of that entire era, and one of the best examples of this is this Ancient Mew card. Because if you look at the card itself, you might not understand why it holds such a special place with collectors. The artwork is very unique, right? It's very recognizable. But the reason people remember this Ancient Mew card goes beyond what is printed on the card itself. It's connected to where it came from, a movie theater, and that changes everything. Because most Pokemon cards become memories because of what happens after we own them. We pull them, we trade them, put them in our collections and binders. But this Ancient Mew was different. For many collectors, the memory started before you even got the card in your binder. It was attached to the experience, going to see the Pokemon movie, receiving the card, having something physical that proved I was there. And that's incredibly powerful, because thousands of collectors, they share that similar memory. Not because they all own the same card, but because they experienced that same moment. The card became more than a collectible. It becomes a souvenir, a reminder, a snapshot of a specific time in Pokemon's history. But some cards don't represent a moment, they represent a change. A point where the hobby itself started seeing cards completely differently. And one of the best examples of that is this Blaine's Charizard, because today, trainer Pokemon feel completely normal. But when they first became part of the hobby, they changed what Pokemon cards could represent. Before trainer Pokemon, a card was about one thing, right? The Pokemon itself. A Charizard was about Charizard, its design, its power, its popularity. But trainer Pokemon introduced a completely different idea. Suddenly, you're not just collecting Charizard, you're collecting Blaine's Charizard. You're not just getting Gyarados, but Misty's Gyarados, right? You're not just getting Mewtwo, but it's Team Rocket's Mewtwo. And that small change created something much bigger. The Pokemon no longer existed alone, it belonged somewhere and to someone. The card started telling stories about relationships, about trainers, about the world around the Pokemon. Some cards don't just preserve artwork, they preserve these moments. And they remind us what collecting looked like, what collectors cared about, and what made each era of Pokemon unique. But there is another level of connection, because sometimes a card doesn't just represent a moment in Pokemon's history, sometimes it captures the Pokemon itself. We've talked about cards that make us wonder, cards that bring us back to memories, and cards that represent entire moments in Pokemon's history. But sometimes a card becomes unforgettable for a different reason. Sometimes the artwork captures a Pokemon so perfectly that we can't imagine that Pokemon any other way. Have you ever looked at a Pokemon card and thought, yes, that's exactly how this Pokemon should feel? Not because it's rare or expensive, but because everything about the image was right. The pose, the expression, the environment, and personality. The artwork understands what makes that Pokemon unique. And I think collectors notice that more than we realize. Because the best Pokemon artwork doesn't always create a personality, sometimes it reveals the personality that was already there. And a perfect example of this is Sudowoodo. Because there are many ways an artist could draw Sudowoodo. They can make him look powerful or mysterious. They could have Sudowoodo battling another Pokemon, but that would miss the entire point. Because Sudowoodo is memorable for one simple reason: it wants everyone to believe it's a tree. And that's the joke. That's its entire personality. And the best artwork understands that. It doesn't try to make Sudowoodo something it isn't. It simply shows Sudowoodo being Sudowoodo. And that is why collectors connect with cards like this. The artist didn't create the personality, they recognized it. And the same idea applies to Snorlax. Because there are hundreds of ways you could draw Snorlax, battling, moving, maybe doing something unexpected. But the most memorable Snorlax cards usually understand one simple thing: Snorlax is Snorlax. It sleeps, it blocks paths, it causes problems without even realizing it. And when an artwork captures that, it feels natural. It feels like a moment that could actually happen. And that is a difficult thing for artwork to accomplish, because technically impressive artwork is everywhere. Beautiful colors, amazing detail, incredible composition. But a card can look incredible and still not become unforgettable, because the Pokemon could be replaced. The best artwork asks a different question. Not, does this look good? It asks, does this feel true? Because when an artist truly understands a Pokemon, the card, it stops feeling like an illustration. It starts feeling like a moment from that Pokemon's world. And I think that is why some Pokemon cards become impossible to replace. Collectors don't just connect with cards because they're rare. They connect because sometimes someone captured exactly what made that Pokemon special. But there is still one final piece of the puzzle, because sometimes a card doesn't just capture a Pokemon, sometimes it becomes part of our story. We've talked about cards that tell stories, cards that bring back memories, cards that represent entire eras of Pokemon collecting, and cards that understand the personality of a Pokemon. But sometimes a card reaches another level. Sometimes a card doesn't just show a Pokemon, it becomes the Pokemon. I think every collector has experienced this. You see an artwork, and before you even think about the card itself, you immediately recognize the feeling. You think, yes, this is exactly how this Pokemon should feel. Not because it's the rarest or most expensive, but because something about it feels true. Maybe the atmosphere, the personality, the emotion, everything comes together. And a perfect example of this is Darkrai. Because Darkrai has appeared on many different Pokemon cards, different sets, plenty of different artists with different interpretations, and every version brings something different. But once in a while, an artwork captures something about a Pokemon that feels impossible to recreate. For Darkrai, that feeling is mystery and isolation. The sense that there is something about this Pokemon we don't completely understand. And the best Darkrai artwork doesn't simply show a dark Pokemon. It captures what Darkrai actually represents: a presence, an atmosphere, a feeling. It doesn't just look like Darkrai, it feels like Darkrai. And that is much harder to accomplish than simply creating a beautiful card, because beauty alone is not enough. A card can have incredible colors, amazing detail, a perfect composition, and still not become unforgettable. Because the artwork has to communicate something deeper. It has to understand that Pokemon. And maybe that's the biggest difference between a card that looks impressive and a card that becomes a collector's favorite. A great card doesn't just show us something, it makes us feel something. So why do some Pokemon cards become impossible to forget while others disappear over time? Because the cards we remember aren't always the ones everyone tells us are important. Sometimes they're the ones that make us imagine a story. Sometimes they are the cards that bring us back to a moment from our lives. Sometimes they represent an entire era of Pokemon collecting. And sometimes they capture a Pokemon so perfectly that we can't imagine it any other way. But the most meaningful cards all have one thing in common: they create a connection between the artwork, the Pokemon, the collector, and the moment in time. And that's why collecting is so interesting. Because a true collector, their favorite isn't just a card that everyone agrees is valuable, it's the card that gives them a reason to care. Because in the end, the best Pokemon cards aren't always the ones with the highest price tags, they're the ones that tell a story we never forget. Now I'd love to hear your answer. What is one Pokemon card you will never forget, and why? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.